The knock came at 12 past midnight. When Frank opened the door, his neighbor Rachel was standing there in a funeral dress mascara, running hands shaking. She had buried her husband 6 hours ago and couldn't walk back into their house. Frank hadn't let anyone through that door since his wife left him 3 years ago. Letting Rachel in would be the most dangerous thing he'd done since. Not because of her, because of what she might make him feel again. 3 years. That was how long Frank Brooks had lived behind a locked door. Not just the one at the front of his house on Ridgefield Lane, but the one inside his chest, the one he had installed the night his ex-wife Denise stood in the kitchen still smelling like another man's cologne and told him she had been leaving long before she actually left. She had been kind about it, which made it worse. She didn't scream. She didn't blame him. She just said, "I don't feel anything when I come home anymore, Frank." And that sentence had done more damage than any insult ever could. He rebuilt after that the way a man rebuilds after a fire, not by decorating but by reinforcing. He stripped his life down to its bones. Work at the logistics firm downtown where he was reliable and invisible in equal measure. Grocery runs on Sunday mornings before the store got crowded. Bourbon in the armchair after dark lights off the house sealed tight around him like a second skin. He kept the thermostat at 68 degrees year-round. He ate from the same ceramic bowl every night. He didn't adjust things for comfort because comfort had never been the point. The point was to never again hand someone the power to make him feel like an empty room. Ridgefield Lane was the kind of street where everyone knew just enough about each other to fill a polite conversation and not one detail more. Frank had perfected that balance. He waved. He nodded. He carried Mrs. Whitfield's groceries when her hip flared up, and he shoveled old Mr. Patterson's walkway after snowstorms without being asked. But not a single person on that street had ever crossed his threshold. That lined front porch to foyer was the border of everything he protected, and no amount of neighborly goodwill was worth breaching it. Rachel Ashford had moved into number 14, the house directly across the street about 2 years before. Frank had noticed her the way he noticed everything quietly from a safe distance, and only through the kitchen window while his coffee brewed. She gardened in the early mornings, kneeling in the dirt with gloves that were always too big for her hands. Her husband David left for work at the same time every day, tall and sandy-haired, the kind of man who smiled at people whether they smiled back or not. He had waved at Frank every single morning for 2 years, and Frank had returned it with a nod that never quite became a wave close enough to be polite, far enough to mean nothing. They had never had a real conversation, not once. Frank could not have said what Rachel did for a living, what her voice sounded like when she laughed, or whether she took her coffee with sugar. She was a figure in his peripheral vision present, but uncatalogued the way a painting in a waiting room exists without being truly seen. Then 9 days before the knocking, David Ashford was killed. A delivery truck ran a red light on Route 9, and the sedan David was driving folded like paper. Mrs. Whitfield delivered the news at 7 in the morning, standing on Frank's porch with her hand over her heart, whispering, as if saying it too loud would make it more real. Frank had listened, thanked her, and closed the door. He stood in the hallway for a long time after that. Not grieving he hadn't known David well enough for grief, but feeling something heavier. The blunt reminder that no amount of control could stop the world from reaching in and taking whatever it chose. The funeral was on a Thursday. Frank watched from behind his living room curtains as the black cars lined the street, as the mourners walked into number 14 in slow, respectful clusters, as the hearse pulled away and left behind nothing but tire marks and silence. He did not attend. He had no right to be there. He had never even learned David's middle name. By evening, the street was empty again. Frank poured his bourbon, sat in his armchair, turned the lights off. The neighborhood settled into the kind of quiet that only exists in suburbs after dark, thick-padded, almost deliberate. He sat there for hours, thinking about nothing, which was a skill he had worked hard to develop. And then came the knocking. Now Rachel Ashford was standing inside his living room, and Frank was trying to remember the last time another human being had occupied this space. The air felt different, heavier, warmer, charged with something he couldn't name. She sat on the edge of his couch like she was afraid to leave a mark, knees pressed together, the black dress wrinkled and damp at the hem from the rain that had started outside. Her hands were shaking. Not a dramatic tremor, but a small, persistent vibration, the kind that comes from muscles that have been clenched too long and have forgotten how to stop. Frank filled a glass of water in the kitchen and brought it to her. He set it on the table, not handed it to her. Set it down, the difference between care and intimacy, carefully maintained, and then sat in his armchair, the seat farthest from the couch. The geometry was deliberate. Two people in the same room with the maximum possible distance between them. Rachel drank the water in small sips, her throat working hard with each swallow, as though even the act of drinking required effort she didn't have. Frank watched her the way he watched everything from the edges without commitment, cataloging details he didn't want but couldn't stop collecting. The dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide anymore. The rawness around her nostrils from tissues used too many times. The way her left hand kept reaching for something at her collarbone, a necklace maybe, or just the habit of reaching for something that used to be there. "I keep hearing his voice," Rachel said, and the sentence came out like it had been sitting in her chest for hours, pressing against her ribs. "In the house. I know it's not real. I know that. But I walked into the bedroom tonight, and I swear I heard him say my name, and my whole body just—" She folded forward, pressing both hands against her eyes. "I'm sorry. You don't need this. I shouldn't be sitting here telling you this." "You're not doing anything wrong," Frank said. The words surprised him. They belonged to a version of himself he thought he had retired, the version that knew how to be present for someone else's pain without running from it. Rachel looked at him through her fingers, and her expression was something Frank recognized from the inside, the look of a person trying to figure out whether the ground beneath them was real or about to give way. "Do you have family nearby?" Frank asked. He was already building the exit strategy in his head, a phone call, a ride, a hotel. Something that would move her from his couch to somewhere else, somewhere that wasn't his problem. "Michigan," Rachel said. "My parents. But they couldn't stay after the funeral. My dad has a heart condition and the travel—" She trailed off, shaking her head. "And David's parents flew back to Portland this afternoon. His mother could barely look at me during the service. I think she blames me for not making him take a different route that morning." Frank said nothing to that because there was nothing to say. Blame after death was irrational and permanent, and no words from a stranger on a couch would change it. "What about friends?" he asked. Rachel's mouth tightened. They were his friends. That's what I realized today, standing at the reception, watching all of them hug me with one arm and check their phones with the other. 2 years in this neighborhood, and every relationship I have here came through David. Every dinner invitation, every block party, every coffee run, it was always David and Rachel. Without him, I'm just the woman in the black dress that nobody quite knows what to do with. The honesty of it hit Frank harder than he expected. He understood what it meant to stand in a room full of people and feel like the only one not connected to anything. He had felt it at his own wedding reception, surrounded by Denise's family, smiling at people who would later pretend they never knew him. "I'll call a hotel," Rachel said, reaching for her phone on the cushion beside her. Her movements were slow, heavy, like a person moving through water. "It's past midnight," Frank said, "and you look like you haven't slept since before the funeral." Rachel's hand stopped. She stared at the phone in her palm, and something in her face shifted the last thin layer of composure, cracking not dramatically, but in the way ice cracks on a lake, slow and inevitable. "I haven't. I can't close my eyes without seeing the hospital. The way he looked when they—" She swallowed the rest of the sentence whole. Frank felt the pull inside his chest, two forces grinding against each other like tectonic plates. One was the rule, the 3-year promise he had made to himself. No one comes in. No one gets close. No one gets the chance to leave a mark. The other was something older than the rule, something that existed before Denise, before the betrayal, before the armor. The simple human inability to watch someone drown while standing on solid ground. He got up without speaking, walked to the hallway closet and pulled out a clean blanket and a pillow. He brought them back and placed them on the far end of the couch. No flourish, no warmth in the gesture. Just the mechanical act of providing what was needed and nothing more. "You can stay tonight," Frank said. "Couch is yours. I'll be in my room, door closed. In the morning, we figure out your next move." Rachel stared at the blanket like it was something she didn't deserve. When she looked up at him, her eyes were wet again, but different this time, not the wild, desperate tears from the porch. Something quieter, something that landed in the space between gratitude and exhaustion. "Thank you, Frank." It was the first time she had ever said his name. He had heard her say David's name 100 times, calling across the yard, laughing on the porch, the casual way married people use each other's names like punctuation. But hearing his own name in her voice felt foreign, like a word borrowed from a language he no longer spoke. He nodded once the way he ended every interaction, clean, minimal, final. "Lock the front door. Good night." His bedroom door closed behind him with a soft click, and Frank stood in the dark, listening. The couch creaked as Rachel lay down. The blanket rustled. Then a sound he almost missed, a single sharp inhale followed by the muffled press of fabric against a face. She was crying into the pillow, trying to be silent about it the way people cry when they don't want to be a burden in someone else's house. Frank sat on the edge of his bed and pressed his palms flat against his knees. His heart was beating faster than it should have been, not from fear and not from attraction, but from the simple, terrifying awareness that he had just done something he could not undo. He had opened the door. He had let someone in. And now a woman he barely knew was crying on his couch, and her grief was already finding the cracks he thought he had sealed. He didn't sleep. He lay on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling, counting the hours by the shifting shadows. Outside, the rain hit the windows in soft, uneven bursts. Inside, the house felt different. Not wrong exactly, but altered. The air carried a weight it hadn't held before, the invisible gravity of another person's presence, and Frank couldn't decide whether it felt like an intrusion or a relief. That was the part that frightened him. Not that Rachel was here, but that some small, buried part of him was glad she was. The next morning, Frank woke at 5:30, the way he always did. No alarm, just the internal clock of a man who had trained his body to need nothing beyond routine. He lay still for a moment, listening. The house was quiet, but not the kind of quiet he was used to. There was a texture to it, a faint human layer underneath the stillness, the sound of someone else breathing on the other side of a wall. He got up, dressed, and opened his bedroom door slowly. Rachel was asleep on the couch, curled into the blanket like she was trying to disappear inside it. The pillow was damp. Her shoes sat neatly on the floor beside the couch, lined up with a care that struck him as oddly deliberate, as though even in the middle of collapse, she had the instinct to keep things orderly in a house that wasn't hers. Frank made coffee. He used the same mug he always used, but when the pot was ready, he pulled a second mug from the cabinet, one he hadn't touched in 3 years, white, with no design, bought during a life that no longer existed. He filled it and set it on the counter, where Rachel would see it when she woke up. Then he left for work. When he came home that evening, Rachel was sitting in the same spot. The coffee mug was empty, washed, and placed upside down on the drying rack. The blanket was folded. She looked like she had showered, her hair was wet, and she was wearing the same black dress, but it looked like she had tried to smooth the wrinkles out by hand. "I went across the street," Rachel said, her voice thin but steadier than the night before. "I tried to stay. I got as far as the kitchen and saw his cereal box on top of the fridge, the one he always ate from the brand I told him was terrible, and I just turned around and walked back out." Frank set his keys on the counter. He had spent the entire workday constructing a speech in his head, a kind, firm explanation of why she couldn't stay another night, why it wasn't appropriate, why he wasn't the right person for this. But standing in his kitchen looking at a woman who couldn't survive the sight of a cereal box, every word he had rehearsed felt small and cruel. He didn't say the speech. He didn't say anything. He just opened the refrigerator, pulled out what he had, and cooked enough dinner for 2 people. He set her plate on the table. He took his to the armchair in the living room and ate alone. The distance was intentional, and Rachel seemed to understand it. Without being told, she stayed at the table. He stayed in his chair, and the 12 feet between them was an agreement neither of them had spoken out loud. That was how the first week went. Rachel existed in Frank's house like a ghost, with a physical form present but barely visible, careful not to touch too much, sit too long in one spot, or leave any evidence of herself beyond the folded blanket and the washed mug. She went to number 14 once a day, always coming back within the hour, sometimes within minutes, her face tight with the effort of trying to exist in a space that had become a shrine to a man who would never walk through its door again. Frank noticed all of it. He couldn't help it. 3 years of living alone had sharpened his awareness of his own environment to an almost painful degree. He could tell if a chair had been moved an inch, if a light had been left on, if the air carried the faint trace of someone else's shampoo. Rachel's presence registered in 1,000 small disruptions, the bathroom mirror slightly fogged when he got home, the couch cushion still warm the way the house smelled different in the evenings. Not bad, not perfume, just the unmistakable scent of another person's existence layered over his own. It annoyed him. Not Rachel herself, she was quiet, respectful, almost invisible in her effort to take up as little space as possible. What annoyed him was the disruption, the crack in the system. The fact that his perfectly sealed world now had a draft coming through it, and he couldn't locate the exact point of entry to patch it shut. By the end of the first week, he had stopped cooking dinner in 2 separate locations. They ate at the table together not because he invited her, but because the ritual of carrying his plate to the armchair started to feel ridiculous, a performance of distance that required more energy than the distance was worth. They didn't talk much during those meals. Rachel picked at her food. Frank ate steadily, but they sat across from each other, and that was its own kind of conversation. The shift happened on a Tuesday sometime during the second week. Frank couldn't sleep, not unusual for him, but this time the insomnia had a different quality, restless instead of numb. He went to the kitchen at 2 in the morning and sat at the table with the lights off, scrolling through his phone the way people do when they're not really looking for anything. His thumb stopped on a photograph he should have deleted long ago. Him and Denise at a barbecue 3 summers before the divorce, her arm around his neck, both of them laughing at something he couldn't remember. He stared at it the way a man stares at evidence of a crime committed against him, not with longing, but with the bewildered disbelief that he had once been that open, that unguarded, that stupid. He didn't hear Rachel come in. When he looked up, she was standing in the hallway entrance, wrapped in the blanket from the couch, her face half lit by the glow from his phone screen. She didn't say anything. She didn't ask what he was looking at or who was in the picture. She just looked at him with an expression that had no pity in it, only recognition. The look of one wounded person identifying another. Rachel sat down across from him, and for a long time they stayed like that, 2 people in a dark kitchen at 2 in the morning, not speaking, not needing to. It was Frank who broke first. Not with a sob, not with a confession, but with a sentence that came out so quietly it barely qualified as sound. She left me for someone she worked with. I found out on a Tuesday. She told me on a Thursday. She was gone by Saturday. He looked at the phone screen one more time, then turned it face down on the table. I haven't talked about it since. Rachel pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. David used to sing in the shower. Every morning, badly. I used to bang on the door and tell him to stop. Her voice cracked on the last word. Now I stand in the bathroom and it's so quiet I can hear the pipes. Neither of them said anything after that. They didn't need to. Something had shifted in the space between them, not toward romance, not toward friendship, but toward the kind of raw, undecorated honesty that only exists between people who have both been broken and are too tired to pretend otherwise. Frank had spent 3 years making sure no one ever saw behind his guard. Rachel had walked right up to it, not with a battering ram, but with her own damage, and something inside him had recognized the shape of her wounds as a mirror of his own. After that night, the silence between them changed. It was no longer the tense, careful quiet of two strangers sharing a roof. It became something looser, more lived in, the kind of silence that exists between people who have agreed without words that not everything needs to be said out loud. Frank came home from work, and Rachel was there, and the fact of her being there stopped feeling like a disruption and started feeling like a fact, like furniture, like weather. They developed a rhythm that had no name. Rachel started cooking some nights simple things, pasta, soup, whatever she could manage with what was in his nearly empty kitchen. Frank started leaving the living room light on when he went to bed, a small, unconscious gesture that meant something he refused to examine. They watched the news together without commenting on it. They drank coffee in the morning at the same table, reading different things on their phones, existing in parallel. Not a couple, not roommates. Something in between that no word had been invented for yet. Frank knew he should be alarmed by how natural it felt. He knew the pattern closeness leads to comfort. Comfort leads to need leads to dependence. Dependence leads to the moment when the other person walks out and takes a piece of you with them. He had lived that sequence from beginning to end, and he had sworn he would never live it again. But knowing and feeling are two different languages, and his body was starting to speak one while his mind insisted on the other. The neighborhood noticed before Frank was ready for it. It started small a look from Mr. Patterson when Frank pulled into the driveway and Rachel was visible through the front window. A pointed comment from a woman named Sandra at the end of the block who stopped Frank at the mailbox and said, "I saw your friend's car is still across the street. She doing all right?" With the kind of emphasis on friend that made it clear she meant something else entirely. But the real confrontation came from Diane Hartwell, 3 houses down, a woman in her early 60s, who had been close with David. She had organized the reception after the funeral. She had known David since he and Rachel moved to the block, and she carried that relationship like a title as though proximity to the dead granted moral authority over the living. Diane appeared on Frank's porch on a Saturday afternoon during the 3rd week. She didn't knock the way Rachel had desperate fractured. She knocked the way someone knocks when they believe they have a right to be heard. Frank opened the door and found her standing with her arms crossed, reading glasses perched on her head, wearing the expression of a woman who had already decided how this conversation would end. "I'll be direct," Diane said, skipping every pleasantry she had ever offered him across a fence or at a block party. "Rachel has been staying here for almost 3 weeks. People are noticing. People are talking." Frank leaned against the door frame. "People can talk." Diane's jaw tightened. "That woman buried her husband less than a month ago. She's not in her right mind. She's vulnerable, and I don't think she's making good decisions right now." The implication sat between them like a third person. Frank felt it land the weight of what Diane was really saying, the things she would never put into exact words because exact words could be challenged. A young widow, a black man living alone, an arrangement that didn't fit the neighborhood's template for acceptable grief. "I'm not doing anything to Rachel," Frank said, his voice flat, controlled, scrubbed of every emotion that was screaming beneath it. "She needed somewhere to stay. She's staying. That's the whole story." "I'm not suggesting anything inappropriate," Diane said, though her tone suggested exactly that. "I'm saying she has options. David's mother has been calling. There are people who can help her, people who knew David, who understand what she's going through." Frank wanted to ask Diane where those people had been at 1 in the morning when Rachel was shaking on his porch. He wanted to ask where they had been for the 9 days between the accident and the funeral when Rachel had been alone in a house that smelled like a dead man's aftershave. He wanted to ask whether this conversation would be happening at all if his skin were a different color. He didn't ask any of it. He had spent a lifetime learning which battles were worth fighting and which ones would only leave him standing in the same place angrier and more exhausted than before. "I appreciate your concern," Frank said, and he closed the door. He turned around and found Rachel standing in the hallway. She had heard everything. Her face was white, her hands clenched at her sides, and there was something in her eyes Frank hadn't seen before. Not grief, not fragility, but anger. Clear, sharp, undiluted anger. "That is not her decision," Rachel said, her voice low and steady. "Who I stay with, where I go, none of that belongs to her." Frank looked at her and felt something shift, a recalibration, like adjusting the lens on a camera until the image finally snaps into focus. For 3 weeks, he had been thinking of Rachel as someone who needed help, a person in crisis, a temporary presence that would eventually leave the way all temporary things leave. But the woman standing in his hallway, jaw set, eyes burning, was not a person waiting to be rescued. She was someone who had chosen to be here, and she was willing to fight for that choice. "She's not wrong about one thing," Frank said carefully. "People are going to keep talking." Rachel looked at him. "Let them." 2 words. And they landed harder than anything she had said since the night she showed up on his porch. Something changed between them after Diane's visit, but it wasn't what either of them expected. Instead of pulling closer, they became aware of the gravity between them, and that awareness introduced a new kind of tension. Frank caught himself watching Rachel in the kitchen and looked away too fast. Rachel started a sentence 3 different times one evening and abandoned each one, settling into a silence that felt full of words she hadn't figured out how to say. The balance held for another week. Then it broke. On a Friday night near the end of the 4th week, Frank came home and noticed Rachel's phone on the kitchen counter screen still lit. He didn't mean to look. He wasn't the kind of man who read other people's messages. But the name on the screen caught his eye the way a sudden movement catches a flinch. Patricia Ashford, David's mother, the woman who had barely looked at Rachel at the funeral, the woman who blamed her. The message thread was long, weeks long. Rachel had been talking to Patricia since before she showed up on Frank's porch, maybe since the day David died. And from the fragments Frank saw before he forced himself to look away, the conversation was not casual. Patricia wanted Rachel to come to Portland, to sort out the estate, to sell the house on Ridgefield Lane, to start living properly, a phrase that sat inside quotation marks in the text like a command disguised as a suggestion. Rachel had not mentioned any of it. Not once. Not during the dinners, not during the 2 a.m. kitchen confessions, not during the weeks of silence and slow trust, and the careful, fragile thing they had been building between them. She had kept an entire parallel conversation hidden, and Frank felt the discovery hit him in the exact place where Denise's betrayal still lived, the soft, unhealed tissue between trust and certainty. When Rachel came back from the bathroom, she found Frank standing by the counter, her phone face down where he had left it, his arms at his sides. "How long have you been talking to Patricia?" he asked. Rachel's face changed. Not guilt exactly, but the sudden tension of someone caught between 2 truths, neither of which she was ready to speak. "Frank, how long?" "Since before the funeral." Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. "She calls every few days. She wants me to come to Portland and handle the estate. The house, the accounts, David's things. She says I need to move on the right way. And you didn't think I should know that it's not about you." The sentence was true, and it cut anyway. Frank felt it open something inside him, not anger at Rachel, but anger at himself. At the part of him that had started to believe this was different, that this time the person standing in his kitchen was not going to disappear one morning with a suitcase and a text message he would read over and over until the screen cracked. "You're right," Frank said. His voice was even controlled the way it always was when everything inside him was collapsing. "It's not about me, and I should have remembered that." "That's not what I meant," Rachel said, stepping toward him. "I let you in." Frank didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The words carried their own weight. "I broke every rule I had. I let you sit in my kitchen, and I told you things I haven't told anyone in 3 years. And the whole time you had a plan to leave and you didn't say a word." Rachel's eyes filled. "I don't have a plan. Patricia has a plan. I'm just trying to survive each day without falling apart, and I didn't tell you because I didn't know how." "That's what Denise said," Frank replied, and the moment the name left his mouth, he knew he had crossed a line. He had compared them. He had taken the one thing Rachel was not his ex-wife and held it up like a mirror, and the reflection was ugly and unfair, and he couldn't take it back. Rachel stared at him. The tears fell, but her face was hard. "I am not her," she said, each word separate and deliberate. "And you don't own me just because you opened your door. I didn't ask to be your redemption project." The sentence hung in the air between them, and neither of them moved. Two people standing in a kitchen 6 feet apart, both right, both wounded, both saying the truest and cruelest things they could find, because the truth and the cruelty lived in the same place. Rachel picked up her phone. She picked up the small bag of clothes she had bought during the second week from a store downtown, because she couldn't bring herself to go into number 14's closet, where David's shirt still hung in a row. She walked to the front door. She didn't look back. "Thank you for everything," she said. And the politeness of it was the worst part, worse than anger, worse than tears. The sound of someone retreating behind formality because the real words were too dangerous to say. The door closed. Frank stood in the kitchen and listened to her footsteps cross the street, heard the faint sound of number 14's front door opening and shutting. Then nothing. The house returned to its original silence, the silence he had cultivated, curated, protected for 3 years. It was exactly what he wanted, and it felt like the ground had opened beneath him. Saturday morning arrived the way it always had before Rachel, quiet, orderly, untouched. Frank stood in the kitchen at 6, holding the mug he drank from every day, and stared at the cabinet where the white mug sat behind it. He didn't open the cabinet. He didn't need to. He could feel its presence the way a man feels a bruise without pressing on it. He cleaned, not because the house was dirty, but because cleaning was the only language he had for putting things back the way they were. He washed the couch cushion covers. He folded the blanket she had used for 4 weeks and pressed it into the hallway closet, pushing it deep into the shelf where he wouldn't see it every time he passed. He opened the windows and let the cool air move through the rooms, carrying away whatever was left. The trace of her shampoo, the warmth of shared meals, the invisible weight of another person's breathing layered over his own. By afternoon, the house was restored. Every surface wiped. Every object returned to its position. The thermostat at 68, the armchair facing the window, the front door locked. And it was unbearable. Frank sat in the armchair that evening with his bourbon, and for the first time the ritual collapsed. Not dramatically, not a thrown glass, not a scream. It just stopped working. The chair felt wrong. The bourbon tasted flat. The darkness he usually found calming pressed against him like something with hands. He had spent 3 years perfecting this exact arrangement, the solitary evening, the controlled silence, the absence of risk, and now it felt like sitting inside a photograph of a life rather than living one. The quiet was the worst part. Before Rachel, this silence had been his ally, a clean and neutral thing that asked nothing of him. Now it had a shape, the shape of an empty couch, an unused plate, a hallway where no one stood at 2 in the morning, wrapped in a blanket, saying nothing, needing nothing except the knowledge that someone else was awake. He looked at the kitchen table and remembered 2 plates. He looked at the couch and saw the impression her body had left in the cushion before he washed it away. He looked at the front door and thought about how different the sound of it closing had been when she walked out, not the clean click he was used to, but something heavier, the sound of a decision he had forced her to make. Frank set the bourbon down and leaned forward, elbows on his knees. 3 years. He had spent 3 years telling himself this was discipline, this was wisdom, this was a man learning from his mistakes. But sitting in the dark with the clarity that only arrives after you've already done the damage, he understood what it actually was. Not protection. Hiding. The kind of hiding that looks respectable because you keep the house clean and show up to work on time, but it's still a man sitting alone in a room choosing the safety of nothing over the risk of something. He had punished Rachel for Patricia's messages. He saw that now. Rachel had kept a secret, and the secret had landed on the exact scar Denise had left the wound of being the last one to know. But Denise had hidden an affair. Rachel had hidden a grieving mother-in-law's phone calls, not because she was planning to leave, but because she didn't know how to explain the impossible position she was in, the old life pulling from one direction, the new one pulling from another, and her standing in the middle, trying not to be torn apart. He had responded by tearing first. He picked up his phone and found the photograph of Denise. He didn't linger on it this time. He simply deleted it, watched the screen go blank, and felt the blankness settle over him like clearing a table before setting it for a different meal. Across the street, the lights at number 14 were on. Rachel had walked through her own front door on Friday night, and for the first time since David's accident, she had stayed. She sat at the kitchen table and let the grief arrive without fighting it. It came in waves, some sharp enough to fold her in half, others low and rolling, the kind that don't knock you down but never fully recede. David was everywhere in that house. His jacket on the hook, his razor on the bathroom shelf, their wedding photograph in the hallway. Each object a small blade, each room a different kind of ache. But the ache did not destroy her. She was still sitting, still breathing, still here. Over the weekend, Rachel began to understand what had happened inside Frank's house, not just the argument, but the whole thing. 4 weeks of borrowed space, borrowed safety, a borrowed version of warmth that had somehow become real without either of them planning it. She had hidden Patricia's messages, and she understood now why that silence had landed the way it did. Frank didn't need her to be perfect. He needed her to be honest. And she had failed at the one thing he needed most. What she felt for Frank was not what she had felt for David. She knew that without needing to examine it. David was love in the past tense, real, permanent, irreplaceable, and finished. Frank was something that hadn't been named yet, not a replacement, not a consolation. He was the first evidence she had found that the future was not just an empty room she would have to sit in alone. She didn't call him. She needed to know that what she felt could survive without his house, his kitchen, his quiet presence across the table. She needed to stand in her own home surrounded by David's things and still feel it. She did. Monday evening came with a thin rain and a sky the color of old steel. Frank stood on his front porch and looked across the street at number 14. The porch light was on. The silver Subaru sat in the driveway. Through the front window, the warm glow of a lamp. He crossed the street before the decision was fully formed, his feet moving ahead of his thoughts the way they had the night he pulled the blanket from the closet, the night he left the living room light on all those small surrenders his body made while his mind was still arguing. He climbed the porch steps, the same steps mourners had walked up weeks ago, carrying casseroles and sympathy that expired by the time they reached their cars, and he stood in front of Rachel's door. The irony was exact, and he felt it in his chest. Same position, same hour, same fear. Except Rachel had knocked out of desperation and Frank was knocking out of something harder choice. 3 knocks, steady, evenly spaced, footsteps inside, the lock turning. The door opened and Rachel stood there in a sweatshirt and jeans, her hair pulled back her face without makeup, her eyes still carrying the faint redness that weeks of grief leave behind like a watermark. She looked at him the way a person looks at something they had been hoping for but had trained themselves not to expect. "I'm scared," Frank said. No preamble, no rehearsed speech. Just the raw, unguarded truth delivered in a voice stripped of every defense he had worn for 3 years. I've been calling it something else, being careful, being smart, protecting myself, but it's fear. That's all it's ever been. He held her gaze and did not look away. I'm scared, but I'm more scared of going back to that armchair and sitting in the dark alone than I am of standing here. Rachel looked at him from the doorway. Her eyes were wet, but the tears didn't fall. Not because she was holding them back, but because this moment belonged to something other than crying. Something that needed presence more than release. I should have told you about Patricia, Rachel said softly. I should have told you everything. I was afraid that if I did, you'd think I was already gone. I know, Frank said, and I shouldn't have compared you to someone you've never been. You're not David either, Rachel said, and I don't need you to be. I need something that doesn't have his shape. They stood there in the doorway, with the rain falling softly behind Frank and the porch light casting a yellow circle around them both. There was no embrace, no kiss, no grand gesture that collapsed the distance between the last 4 weeks and what came next. That wasn't who they were, two people who had both learned through different kinds of loss that the real moments are never the dramatic ones. The real moments are the ones where you stand in front of another person with nothing to offer except the willingness to stay. Rachel stepped to the side. Frank stepped through the door, and they stood together in the hallway of a house that still held a dead man's jacket on its hook and a wedding photograph on its wall, not because the past had been erased, but because the future had been given permission to exist alongside it. Behind them, the front door stayed open. The porch light hummed. The rain came down on Ridgefield Lane in soft, steady taps falling on every rooftop on the block, including number 14, where two people stood together for the first time without anything between them. The door wasn't locked, and for once that was the point. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not build a wall, it's answer a knock. Frank spent 3 years believing that safety meant solitude, that the only way to survive loss was to never let anything in again. And Rachel spent weeks believing she couldn't stand in her own house without falling apart. They were both wrong, and they were both right. Healing doesn't come from hiding, but it doesn't come from rushing either. It comes from the moment you decide that being afraid is no longer a good enough reason to stay alone. If this story moved something inside you, if Frank's fear reminded you of your own, or if Rachel's grief felt familiar in ways you didn't expect, I'd love to hear about it. Drop a comment below. Tell me about the door you're afraid to open, or the one you're glad you did. And if you know someone who needs to hear this tonight, share it with them. Sometimes the right story finds the right person at exactly the right time. Subscribe. If you haven't already, there are more stories like this one coming, and I don't want you to miss them.